It was supposed to be over. For Gary Simmons, the twisted killer who had been on the run, the moment he drove away from that house in Moss Point, Mississippi, he thought he had gotten away with it. A cold-blooded murder, a life taken in the blink of an eye, and a young woman, Brooke Weber, bound and locked away, helpless in a box. He left behind a trail of blood and terror, yet what he didn't know was that his nightmare was only just beginning. For him, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit perfectly. The authorities had no leads, and his victim, Brooke, was believed to be dead. But there was one crucial detail he couldn't foresee: Brooke Weber was still alive. She had escaped. What happens when the killer believes he's covered his tracks, convinced that his victim will never speak again, only to find out that she has not only survived the nightmare he crafted, but is determined to bring him to justice? Brooke's escape was nothing short of miraculous. Locked in a box, tortured by a man who had already committed murder, she found a way to break free. But that moment of freedom did not mark the end of her story. It was the beginning of a long, painful journey toward truth and revenge. What unfolds next is a story of survival, of unimaginable fear, and of a woman whose courage defied the darkness that sought to consume her. This is a tale of justice, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of a killer who never thought his victim would return to haunt him. In this true crime story, one woman's escape will haunt her forever, but it will also change everything. Brooke Weber was only 18 years old. A young woman with big dreams and a bright future ahead of her. She was just beginning to figure out who she wanted to be, and the world was still full of possibility. She had an infectious smile, a kind heart, and an energy that drew people to her. She loved life, enjoyed hanging out with her friends, and was dating a young man named Jeffrey Wolfe, a relationship that was in that magical, exciting honeymoon phase. Before that summer, there was nothing to suggest the horrors that would come. Brooke, like so many at her age, was exploring love and freedom. She had just met Jeffrey, and they seemed inseparable. They made plans for the future, for vacations, for life. But everything changed when Brooke and Jeffrey decided to go on a road trip, a trip that would lead them straight into a nightmare. On August 12, 1996, Brooke and Jeffrey made the 6-hour drive from Houston, Texas, to Mississippi, where they planned to meet Gary Simmons. Jeffrey had told her that Gary was a friend of his, a business acquaintance, and that they needed to meet him for some work-related matter. Nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary to Brooke. They were young, optimistic, and trusted Jeffrey's judgment. But as the car pulled into Gary's driveway, the air seemed to shift, as if a dark presence was waiting just around the corner. Gary Simmons, on the outside, was a man of average appearance, neither intimidating nor particularly remarkable in any way. He was in his mid-30s, with a quiet demeanor, often soft-spoken, yet his eyes carried a strange coldness, a sense of distance. On the surface, he seemed like anyone else, a man with a routine, a family, and a job. But the reality of who Gary was behind closed doors was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Gary's house sat at the edge of a quiet bayou in Moss Point, Mississippi. It was secluded, far from the bustling streets of the city, tucked away from prying eyes. The house itself had an unsettling quality, as though it had been abandoned for too long yet was somehow still occupied. The windows were half-drawn, the front porch light was dim, and the air around the house felt stagnant, untouched. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the sounds of distant water lapping against the shoreline. It was dark when they arrived. The porch light should have been on, a welcoming sign, but it wasn't. Instead, Gary stood outside on the porch steps, almost as if he were waiting for them. His gaze was too steady, too focused, and something about his posture felt wrong. As though he was sizing them up before they even had a chance to speak. Brooke, always friendly, tried to brush it off, thinking that maybe it was just the exhaustion from the long drive. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As Jeffrey introduced her to Gary, she couldn't help but notice the strange vibe between the two men. They greeted each other warmly, but there was a flicker in Gary's eyes, something calculating, something predatory. They went inside. The house was dark inside too, the only light coming from the dim overhead lamps that flickered intermittently. Gary led them into the kitchen, offering them drinks, small talk that meant little in the grand scheme of things. Jeffrey and Gary began talking business. But Brooke wasn't interested in that. She took a seat at the table, her mind wandering, trying to ease the discomfort building inside her. This was the first moment Brooke would look back on with dread. The moment she would realize she was in the wrong place, with the wrong people. As she sat there, the conversation between Jeffrey and Gary seemed harmless, but the energy in the room shifted subtly, quietly. The tension was building, a low hum she couldn't quite place. Something was wrong. She felt it in her bones. But it was too late to turn back. Without warning, the sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the silence. Brooke looked up in horror as she saw Jeffrey, his chest sprayed with blood. His body crumpled to the ground, the gunshot ringing through the room. The force of the shot sent him crashing to the floor, and behind him stood a young man, holding a gun. Brooke froze, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The blood, the chaos, the shock, it was all too much to process. In that moment, everything Brooke thought she knew about her life vanished. The man she trusted, the man who was supposed to protect her, had just been shot in cold blood. She didn't understand why. Gary moved quickly, his hands grabbing her with terrifying strength. He lifted her as if she were nothing more than a rag doll and carried her to another room. The door slammed shut behind them, and in the darkness of the room, she felt a wave of terror like she had never known. Gary bound her, gagged her, and then locked her inside a box. There, in that small, suffocating space, the horror of what was happening finally settled in. She was trapped. Alone. The sounds of Jeffrey's blood spilling, the chaos of the night, were all fading, replaced by a deafening silence that spoke of something far more dangerous. Brooke Weber's life, once full of possibility, was now reduced to nothing more than a desperate struggle for survival. Locked in a box, alone in the dark, she was left to wonder whether she would ever see the light of day again. And Gary Simmons? He thought he had escaped. He thought he was free. The moment the gunshot rang out, everything changed. Brooke froze. Her mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. There was no time to react. No time to understand. Jeffrey, her new boyfriend, the one person she had trusted in this strange, dark place, was suddenly on the ground, his chest torn open by a bullet. Blood sprayed across the room, splattering onto the blinds, the walls, the floor. The room, once so still, now seemed to pulse with horror. The coppery scent of blood filled the air. It was overwhelming, sickening. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath quickened as she struggled to comprehend the violence that had just unfolded before her. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. How could this be happening? One moment, they were talking, planning their trip, laughing, looking forward to the future, and the next, Jeffrey was dead, his body lying lifeless on the floor. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But all she could do was stare at the blood-stained floor, her body frozen in shock. Her mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what had just transpired. She was paralyzed by fear, by the realization that she was no longer safe. That the man she thought she knew was capable of unspeakable violence. And now, she was alone with him. Gary Simmons stepped forward, a cold, calculating expression on his face. Without a word, he grabbed Brooke by the arms, lifting her with ease as though she were no more than a rag doll. She struggled, but his grip was ironclad. He was too strong. Too fast. The room swirled around her, the world becoming nothing but a blur of terror. Gary didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. He carried her into another room, his hands tight around her, his grip unrelenting. As she fought to break free, she felt her strength slipping away. Her heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears, each beat a reminder of how close she was to dying. She was being taken somewhere, taken to a place she couldn't yet understand. In the dim light of the room, Brooke's body was bound. Ropes were tied around her wrists, her ankles. She felt the scratch of the coarse rope cutting into her skin, the constriction of her muscles as the knots were tied. She tried to scream, but her mouth was gagged with cloth. Her body trembled, not just from the fear, but from the raw, physical panic of knowing there was nothing she could do. She was thrown into the box, the lid slamming shut with a finality that made her blood run cold. The claustrophobia hit her instantly. The space was tiny, dark, suffocating. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. The air was thick, almost stale. The faint smell of dust, of mildew, filled her nostrils. The walls seemed to close in around her, the confined space pressing down on her chest. Her heart raced, each beat louder in her ears as she struggled to breathe. What was happening? Why was she here? Why had Gary done this? The silence was deafening. And in that silence, Brooke's mind began to spiral. She could still hear the echoes of the gunshot, the sound of Jeffrey's body hitting the floor. She could still see the blood, feel the terror that had gripped her. The question nagged at her. Would she survive this? The box became her entire world. Her prison. It wasn't just a physical cage, it was a mental one too. Every second that ticked by in the dark felt like an eternity. She wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? Days? She couldn't tell. The stillness was maddening. The lack of light. The lack of sound. Everything was muffled in the box, like she was trapped in a tomb. Her thoughts raced, her mind flashing between the horror of the present and the fear of what might come next. What did Gary want from her? What was he going to do? Was this just the beginning of his torment, or was he going to kill her too? She didn't know. She couldn't know. But the fear of what he might do next was enough to drive her to the brink of madness. The uncertainty was a cruel weight on her chest, a constant reminder that she had no control over her fate. In the darkness, she tried to calm herself, tried to gather her thoughts, but it was impossible. The box was a suffocating, inescapable reality. She was trapped. Completely trapped. She thought of her family. Of her friends. Of the life she had left behind. What would they think? Would they ever know what happened to her? Was she going to die here, in this box, alone, without ever getting to say goodbye? The thoughts consumed her. But somewhere, deep inside, there was a spark. A tiny, flickering light. A thought, I will survive. She didn't know how, didn't know when, but that small flicker of hope was enough to keep her fighting. Because no matter how dark it seemed, no matter how trapped she felt, she refused to let the darkness consume her. She wasn't ready to die. And so, as the hours stretched on and the silence around her thickened, Brooke Weber began to make her plan. If she was going to survive this, she had to fight. There was no other choice. It was a fleeting moment, but for Brooke Weber, it would become the turning point of her life. Trapped inside that suffocating box, the hours stretched on, each second an eternity of isolation and fear. The darkness pressed in from all sides, but Brooke refused to surrender. She refused to die in that box, to let Gary Simmons' twisted cruelty be the final chapter of her story. But then, something shifted. There was a noise. It was small at first. Just a faint sound that broke through the thick silence. It was the faintest crack, barely noticeable in the stillness of the box. The ropes around her wrists had loosened. For a moment, Brooke wasn't sure if she was imagining it. Could it be? Could she actually be free? Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. It was happening. The possibility of escape was real. Her mind raced, this is my chance. I have to do this. I have no choice. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to move, to act, to make the most of the opportunity before it slipped away. The ropes had been tied tightly around her wrists, but now they were slackening, just enough for her to feel the strength in her hands. She twisted and strained, her fingers scraping against the ropes, working to free herself from their grip. Her body was exhausted. The fear, the constant panic, the hours spent trapped in the dark had drained her. But desperation gave her strength. Her hands shook, her arms screamed in pain, but she didn't stop. Finally, with a snap, the ropes fell loose. Brooke's wrists were free. But it wasn't enough. She wasn't free yet. She was still trapped in the box. In that confined space, the panic rose again. What if I can't get out? What if Gary comes back before I make it? What if I'm caught? But there was no time to second-guess herself. No time to dwell on what-ifs. Every second was critical. She worked quickly, her fingers trembling as they fumbled with the ropes around her ankles. The box was small, cramped, and the air was stifling, but Brooke didn't care. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. She could feel the cool metal of the box against her body, the claustrophobic pressure weighing down on her, but she pushed forward, her determination fueling her movements. At last, the ropes around her ankles gave way. She was free. But the lid of the box was still closed. Brooke could feel it pressing down on her, sealing her in. There was no way out unless she forced it open. She gritted her teeth and pushed against the lid. It didn't budge. Not at first. But then, with a grunt of effort, she summoned every last ounce of strength she had. Her hands pressed against the cold metal, her body strained with effort, and slowly, the lid began to shift. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the silence, and with a final, desperate push, the lid cracked open, letting in a sliver of light from the room above. Brooke gasped for air, her chest heaving, her mind racing with the realization that she was free, but not yet safe. The house was eerily quiet as she crawled out of the box, her limbs stiff from hours of confinement. She could hear nothing except the pounding of her heart in her ears. She moved cautiously, aware that Gary could return at any moment. Her mind raced as she quickly scanned the room. The door was locked, the windows shut tight. But her instincts told her she had to get out, and she had to do it fast. Her eyes landed on the butcher knife resting on a nearby counter. The weapon was heavy, its blade gleaming cold in the dim light, and for a moment, Brooke hesitated. Could she really use it? Was she ready to fight for her life? Her pulse thudded in her ears as she took the knife into her trembling hands. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, and in that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, raw and powerful, but so was the determination, the fierce, unyielding will to survive. She wasn't going to die today. Not in this house. Not at Gary's hands. Brooke moved swiftly, quietly, her every step calculated. She didn't know if Gary was in the house, if he was nearby, but she couldn't wait to find out. She had to take her chance. The fear of being caught was a gnawing, constant presence in her mind, but the adrenaline surged through her, pushing her forward, faster, harder. She reached the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She paused, pressing her ear against it, listening for any sound of movement. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. But Gary could be anywhere. She had to act now. With a deep breath, she threw the door open and stepped into the hallway, the knife gripped tightly in her hand. Her body was tense, every muscle coiled in anticipation of the worst. But she kept moving. She had no choice. Brooke's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears as she moved toward the front door. Each step was a victory, but the fear never stopped. She glanced over her shoulder, terrified that Gary might appear at any moment, but she pushed forward. She was so close now. So close to freedom. And then, she saw it. The front door. The key to her escape. Her hand flew to the doorknob, twisting it quickly, her fingers slick with sweat. She opened the door just wide enough to slip through, and then, she ran. Every step felt like a race against time. The sound of her feet pounding against the dirt echoed in the stillness of the night. She didn't look back. She didn't care to. The only thing that mattered was getting away. Getting away from Gary. Brooke ran, her heart still pounding, her breath sharp and ragged in the cold night air. She wasn't just running from the house, from Gary, she was running toward survival. Toward hope. Toward life. As Brooke Weber ran for her life through the dark streets of Moss Point, the investigation into Jeffrey Wolf's murder was just beginning. The authorities were called to the scene just hours after she managed to escape, and what they found would shake the very foundations of the case. When the Jackson County Sheriff's Department arrived at Gary Simmons' house, they were faced with a chilling mystery. At first glance, the house appeared to be pristine, untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no obvious evidence of the crime that had just occurred. But it didn't take long for the investigators to notice something was amiss. The silence of the house felt wrong, unnerving. It was too still. Too perfect. Something about the scene felt orchestrated, as though it was all designed to hide the gruesome reality that had played out just hours before. As the police moved through the house, their eyes began to settle on the details, the way the furniture had been arranged, the small pieces of blood-stained cloth found near the sink, the faint scent of decay lingering in the air. But it wasn't until they stepped outside and ventured toward the bayou that they made their first horrifying discovery. The water was still, eerily calm, and yet something was floating just beneath the surface. A piece of clothing, a human limb, a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place in the house. As they waded through the muck, one by one, the police began pulling pieces of Jeffrey's dismembered body from the water, each discovery more horrifying than the last. A hand. A foot. A torso. The bayou had become a grotesque dumping ground, a place where Gary Simmons had discarded the remains of his victim with terrifying precision. There were 88 pieces in total, each piece carefully separated, floating just beneath the water's surface, as if mocking the very idea of justice. The police were left speechless, struggling to comprehend the depravity they were witnessing. The scene was a gruesome puzzle, and it was only just beginning to come together. But what had started as an open and shut case, one where Gary Simmons was thought to be the prime suspect, was suddenly becoming much more complicated. The police had evidence, yes, but they needed more. They needed the one thing that could tie everything together, Brooke Weber's testimony. Brooke's escape had been the key that unlocked the investigation. She was the only living witness who knew the full extent of Gary Simmons' horrors. She was the only one who had seen everything firsthand. Who could connect the dots and bring the truth to light? But as Brooke sat down with the investigators, her mind raced. The trauma of the night was still fresh, the memories of Jeffrey's murder and her own captivity still haunting her every thought. As she recounted what had happened, the gunshot, Jeffrey falling to the floor, Gary's brutal assault on her, her voice trembled, but she spoke with the clarity of someone who knew the importance of the truth. Piece by piece, she began to reveal the horrifying details of her captivity. She described how Gary had tied her up, gagged her, and locked her inside a box. She described the feeling of suffocating in the dark, the terror of knowing that her life could end at any moment. Brooke's testimony was nothing short of shocking. But as the investigators pieced her account together with the physical evidence they had uncovered, the full extent of Gary's depravity began to emerge. It wasn't just the murder. It wasn't just the dismemberment. It was the meticulous planning, the twisted satisfaction Gary seemed to take in inflicting pain and fear. The box, the one that had imprisoned Brooke for hours, wasn't just a symbol of her captivity, it was a symbol of Gary's control, his power over his victims. The police now knew what they were dealing with. But they needed to see the box for themselves. When the investigators made their way back to the house and opened the door to the room where Brooke had been confined, they were met with the chilling sight of the box sitting in the corner, just as it had been left. It was old, dusty, covered in a thin layer of grime, but it was clear that it had been used recently. The smell inside the box still lingered, a mixture of stale air and something far more unsettling. The officers, their faces grim, examined the box. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it. It was small, wooden, and unremarkable. But in that simplicity lay its horror. It had been designed to hold someone. To trap them. To keep them in the dark. The very idea that this small, innocuous-looking object had been the instrument of such terror left the investigators shaken. One of the officers, as he knelt beside it, caught a glimpse of something inside, the faintest trace of blood. The box wasn't just a prison. It had become a symbol of Gary Simmons' control over his victims. It wasn't just a tool, it was his signature, the manifestation of his twisted desires. The horror of what had happened inside that box began to sink in. And with that understanding came the realization that Gary Simmons' crimes were far more calculated and monstrous than anyone had anticipated. For Brooke, the discovery of the box was a moment of haunting clarity. She had been trapped there, locked away in the dark, with no idea of the full extent of Gary's cruelty. But as she relayed her story to the authorities, she could see it all now, the puzzle pieces falling into place. She was the key to this case. She was the one who could stop Gary Simmons. And yet, despite the growing certainty of his guilt, the fear never left her. It was clear that Gary Simmons had planned everything with chilling precision. His ability to evade capture for so long made him even more dangerous. The investigation was only just beginning, but with each new discovery, the pieces of Gary's twisted puzzle were coming together, and soon, the truth would be exposed. The courtroom was silent as Brooke Weber took the stand. Every eye in the room was on her, on the young woman who had endured unimaginable horrors and now had to relive them in front of strangers. She had been through so much already, but this moment, this trial, would be one of the hardest. The terror, the isolation, the suffering she'd endured in that small, suffocating box, it all flooded back as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Brooke's hands trembled as she placed them on the witness stand. The sweat on her brow mirrored the intense fear that gripped her heart. She had seen Gary Simmons, he had locked her away, raped her, forced her to witness his crimes. And now, here he was, sitting just a few feet away, as if he hadn't caused any of this devastation. As if he hadn't shattered her life, as if he hadn't torn apart the lives of those who loved Jeffrey Wolfe. Her breath caught in her throat. She had been terrified of this moment. Of facing the man who had destroyed her sense of safety, her peace, and her future. But as the questions began, as she was asked to recount the events of that night, the gunshot, Jeffrey's death, the box, her escape, Brooke felt something shift inside her. The years of fear, of hiding, of running from her past, they began to fall away. She was no longer just the victim. She was the voice of truth. She was no longer confined by Gary's actions or by the horror of that house. This was her moment to fight for justice, to ensure that what happened to her would not be forgotten. She spoke through clenched teeth, but she spoke with the strength of a survivor. Every word she uttered carried the weight of what she had endured. Every word was a testament to the strength that had carried her out of that box, and out of the darkness that had threatened to swallow her whole. Despite the fear still rattling her bones, Brooke managed to stay composed. Her voice quivered at times, her hands shook, but she did not falter. This was her moment to be heard. To make sure that Gary Simmons could never hurt anyone else again. As the prosecutor asked her questions, she told the jury everything. She told them about the gunshot. About the blood. About the box. It was a difficult, painful process. And it was far from over. But as Brooke spoke, something inside her shifted. The fear began to lessen. She was no longer just the girl locked away in a box. She was a survivor, and her testimony was one of the final pieces of the puzzle that would bring Gary Simmons to justice. Gary Simmons, meanwhile, had been on the run. But his time was running out. Despite his best efforts to evade capture, the law had finally caught up with him. His capture came after a tip-off. Someone had seen him hiding out in a remote area, trying to blend in with the shadows. But Gary, despite his efforts to escape, had nowhere to hide. The authorities arrived, and Gary was arrested without incident. His confession was chilling, detached, almost as though he were discussing someone else's crime. Gary never seemed to fully comprehend the enormity of his actions. He confessed to the murder of Jeffrey Wolfe, to the kidnapping and imprisonment of Brooke, to everything. And yet, there was no remorse. No real acknowledgement of the devastation he had caused. His words were cold, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a business transaction, not the brutal murders and unspeakable violence he had inflicted on innocent people. Gary's capture, though a long-awaited victory for the police, brought little relief to those who had been affected by his crimes. His cold demeanor, his lack of emotion as he spoke of the pain he had caused, was a stark reminder of the kind of person he was. A monster hiding behind a mask of normalcy. It was a moment of justice, but not a moment of redemption. The trial continued, and the weight of Brooke's testimony hung over the courtroom like a shadow. And when it was finally time for the verdict, the room was filled with a tense, almost suffocating silence. Brooke sat in the front row, surrounded by Jeffrey's family, her heart pounding. The jury had deliberated for hours, but now, finally, justice was within reach. The verdict was read aloud, and it was as if the room held its breath. Gary Simmons was found guilty of the murder of Jeffrey Wolfe, of kidnapping, and of the abuse he had inflicted on Brooke. He was sentenced to death. The families in the courtroom, especially Jeffrey's parents, finally had their moment of relief. They had waited for this day for so long, and now, they could finally begin to heal. But for Brooke, it wasn't so simple. The weight of what had happened didn't vanish with the verdict. She was free from Gary's control, yes, but the scars he had left would never fully fade. As she left the courtroom that day, surrounded by the support of her family and friends, there was a sense of finality. But there was also something else. Something deeper. A quiet, lingering question, would she ever truly be free of the past? Justice had been served, but the emotional toll of the trial, the memories, the trauma, the pain, would never be fully gone. For Brooke, the trial was not an ending, but a new beginning. A beginning where she could finally take control of her life and her future. But the scars of what happened, the horror of the box, the fear of being hunted, the weight of her testimony, would remain with her, a constant reminder of the strength she had found in herself. And in the end, that strength was what would allow her to heal. Not the verdict. Not Gary's punishment. But her own courage. Her own voice. Brooke Weber's escape was only the beginning of a much longer journey, a journey that would take years, filled with quiet moments of strength and long nights of fear. The immediate aftermath of her escape was overwhelming. She was no longer locked in that small, suffocating box, but the emotional scars remained. The trauma didn't disappear once she was free. Brooke spent those first few months in a haze, unable to process the horror she had lived through. Every noise, every unfamiliar face sent her into a state of alert, as though danger was always just around the corner. Was Gary still out there? Was his family hunting for her? She was constantly looking over her shoulder, her heart racing at every creak of the floorboards or at the slightest sound of someone knocking at her door. Her once carefree personality had shifted into something more guarded, more reserved. The young woman who had walked into Gary's house with an open heart, with trust in her eyes, now walked through the world with caution, her every move calculated, her mind always prepared for the worst. Brooke didn't just change physically, though. She began to build walls, layers of protection between herself and the world around her. Her once bright smile was now often hidden behind a quiet, introspective gaze. She had learned that even the most ordinary places could hide the deepest horrors. She had learned that the world, which once seemed so full of possibilities, could also be full of darkness. But what truly haunted her during these early years was the fear of Gary's family. They were his blood, and the lingering thought that they might hate her for what she had done, bringing their family's name to ruin, was terrifying. She feared they would come after her, that they might see her as the reason for Gary's downfall. She couldn't shake the fear that she would never be safe from them. She changed her identity, moved to different places, and kept a low profile. She lived in a constant state of flux, constantly on the move, never allowing herself to settle. She changed her appearance, cutting her long blonde hair short and dyeing it a dark brown, a visual barrier against any reminder of her past. She went to great lengths to disappear, to slip into the background of the world. It wasn't just her physical appearance that changed, though. Her entire demeanor shifted. She was no longer the carefree, trusting young woman who had once loved life. She was cautious. She was guarded. She was someone who had been broken but was learning to heal. Then came the day when everything changed. The day Brooke learned that Lori Simmons, Gary's wife, wanted to meet her. At first, Brooke didn't know how to respond. Lori, the woman who had been married to the man who tortured and imprisoned her, wanted to see her. The thought of meeting her was terrifying. For so long, Brooke had believed that Lori had to be just as twisted as Gary, complicit in his crimes. But something inside her began to shift. Could she meet this woman and find closure? Could there be some kind of healing in this meeting, an understanding between them, a shared humanity that went beyond Gary's monstrous acts? Brooke hesitated. She spent days thinking about it. The fear was still there, gnawing at the back of her mind, but there was also something else, curiosity. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know if Lori, too, had been trapped in Gary's web. She wanted to know if Lori had suffered too. If she had been a victim in this twisted family dynamic, or if she was just as responsible for the horrors that had unfolded. And so, Brooke agreed. She met Lori. The first meeting was quiet, tentative. Lori, visibly nervous, reached out with a soft, almost broken smile. It was clear she wasn't there to blame Brooke, but to seek something much more profound, an understanding. A reconciliation. Lori had spent years living in fear, trapped in a relationship with a man she had come to realize was a monster. She, too, had been a victim in her own way, manipulated and abused in ways that had left scars of their own. In that moment, as Lori looked into Brooke's eyes and expressed gratitude for the courage Brooke had shown in speaking out, something shifted. For the first time in years, Brooke felt seen, not as a victim, not as the girl in the box, but as a person who had endured, who had survived, and who had triumphed. Lori, in her own way, had been a prisoner, too. They weren't so different after all. Lori expressed her gratitude, her sorrow, and a deep sense of indebtedness to Brooke. She tearfully admitted that, because of Brooke's courage, her children still had a mother, and she was able to heal from the years of torment. "You saved me," Lori whispered through her tears. "You saved all of us." Brooke, for the first time in a long while, felt a sense of peace. There was a sense of finality in that moment, a quiet relief that came from the understanding that, while the past could never be erased, she no longer carried its burden alone. Lori, in her own way, had been trapped by the same man. And now, together, they were both free. For Brooke, the meeting with Lori was the final step in her transformation. No longer just a victim, no longer just a survivor, Brooke was now someone who had found peace. She had faced the darkness, both within herself and from the world around her. She had faced Gary Simmons, his cruelty, and his legacy, and she had emerged stronger. As Brooke walked away from that meeting, the weight of the years of fear, of hiding, of trauma, finally began to lift. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. She was free. But the journey wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time, Brooke knew that she could face the future, not with fear, but with strength, with the knowledge that she had survived. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Brooke Weber's journey is one that will never be fully understood by those who have not lived it. The pain, the fear, the trauma, it's something that lingers long after the physical wounds have healed. But Brooke's story is not just one of survival, it is a story of transformation. When she escaped the darkness of that box, she didn't just escape her captor. She escaped the grip of fear that had once controlled every part of her life. Over the years, Brooke fought not only to rebuild her life but to reclaim it, to take back what was rightfully hers, her peace, her voice, her future. The journey was long. There were times when the weight of the past threatened to break her, when the fear of being hunted, of being found, felt too overwhelming. But with each day, she grew stronger. The fear that once controlled her began to fade, replaced by something far more powerful, a quiet, unshakable strength. Brooke's survival shaped her in ways that can't be quantified. She learned to trust again, not just others, but herself. She learned that the darkness could be survived, and that even after the most unimaginable pain, healing was possible. She learned that survival doesn't just mean living, it means thriving after the storm. Now, Brooke stands as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. She is no longer the victim locked in a box, hiding in the shadows. She is a survivor. She is a warrior. And in her strength, she found the power to heal, not just herself, but others. She wants the world to know that healing is possible. That no matter how dark it gets, there is always hope. Always a way forward. And that is the message she wants to leave you with. To anyone who has ever felt lost, broken, or alone. You are stronger than you know. Your journey may be difficult, but you are not defined by your pain. You are defined by how you rise from it. Brooke's story is proof that we all have the power to change. To overcome. To survive. Now, as Brooke continues her life, moving forward with courage and strength, she carries with her a message that she hopes will resonate with anyone who hears her story. No matter the struggles you face, you too can find the strength to move forward. You too can emerge from the darkness into the light. And now, we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Brooke's shoes? How do you think survivors find the strength to move forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters. And if you want to hear more stories of survival, strength, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe. There's always more to be told, and we'd love for you to be part of this journey with us. Thank you for watching. Remember, you are stronger than you think, and no matter the darkness, the light is always within reach.